Today I'll be speaking with Darcy Gaechter, who is the first woman to kayak the Amazon from source to sea. Now, prior to reading her book, when I think of the Amazon, I think of this tropical warm river with piranhas and parasitic fish and things of that nature. Actually, the river begins in the Andes Mountains, the source of it in the Andes Mountains in Peru. And after the first month of dealing with not only sub-zero waters, but class 5 rapids nonstop, if it wasn't those rapids that could take her life, once she got to the flat water and spent 4 months kayaking down the river, it would have been something like the river pirates, the narcos in the red zone, military insurgents along the way, and all the indigenous tribes who may have felt threatened by them as they were coming down the river.
Quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm great. What part of the world are you in?
I am in Colorado.
Oh, you're.
How about you?
I'm in Cincinnati right now. So I didn't know if you were in the U.S. or down in Ecuador, because you spend half your time down there, yeah?
Yeah, spend our winters in Ecuador and then the summers here in North America.
Yeah. You're originally from that Colorado area, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
So you're here till the summer. When will you actually cut out and head back down to Ecuador?
Middle of October.
And then you'll be there until what, April?
Till early March, usually.
Is there just no work on the other months? Because for the listeners, you run an adventure company.
Yeah, whitewater kayaking business called Small World Adventures, and yeah, Ecuador is our main thing. So we do like 5 months worth of trips down there. And we do trips in the US, but they're pretty sporadic. We'll do like a Grand Canyon trip that's 2 weeks long, Middle Fork Salmon that's a week. But we have a bit more time off in the summer to do things like this. I'm really trying, despite my my shortcomings in promotion, I am trying to promote my new book and do more speaking gigs. And so the summers are a little bit of off time from the guiding business to focus on other projects.
Wow, this sounds completely opposite of the Darcy that I read about in the Amazon Woman book, because you're all about kayaking and you're like, business, like who wants to do that?
Well, I do want to point out that we also spend a lot of time kayaking in the summer. So I'm going kayaking, in fact, as soon as we're finished here. So
nice. So today will you just do a short one? Like what's a short kayak trip for you?
Like 1 hour would be a short kayak trip. Yeah.
I didn't know if it was like a 12-hour day after 148 days on the Amazon or whatever.
Right. No. I mean, sometimes you can just go out for an hour, do like a 6-mile run or something. And sometimes it's a full day adventure or multi-days, but typically during the work week, just sneak out for an hour or two.
Let me ask you this. After so many years of kayaking, because how many years have you been kayaking now? 25?
25 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So after so many years of kayaking, how do you find enjoyment in doing the same thing?
It's still very challenging for me, seeing new rivers. I mean, even though water kind of acts the same all the time, every single river is different and will offer a new challenge. I'm at kind of a weird point in life. I'm 44 years old, and I think class 5 kayaking, which is like the hardest classification of kayaking, typically is a sport more for 20-year-olds and sometimes 30-year-olds. And I still really enjoy doing it. I still find a lot of challenge in it and discovering new rivers. But yeah, I'm kind of at this point where it's like every time I go out on a class 5 river, it's me and Dawn and a bunch of 25-year-old guys. And so it's kind of at a point where it's like, okay, how much longer can I keep this up? Because it is very physically demanding and very mentally demanding. But at this point, I still enjoy it. And I think, sort of to answer your question, every river is different. So I find new challenge in that. At the present moment, I'm finding challenge in maintaining my physical level, since youth is not necessarily on my side anymore. So it's kind of a new challenge in that regard as well. And I just got accepted to do the North Fork Championships, which is like the hardest kayaking race in North America. And a not very nice friend pointed out to me that I could be the mother of all the other competitors. So it's kind of an interesting mental phase right now, I would say.
Listen, we're in the same phase, because I find myself in the gym training with guys, grappling or sparring or whatever it is that I'm doing. And I'm literally more than double the age of some of the guys that I'm on the mat with. And so, but I've gotten to the point now, it's a tough pill to swallow when I had to retire from my career. And I did actually take some time off. Like I kind of walked away and quit training for a little bit, because a lot of what I was doing became about the business rather than the passion. And then after some time off, and when I say some time off, I don't know, 6-9 months, maybe a year tops, where I didn't really go into the gym to train. But then after that time off, I came back in the gym and I started training, and it was about, once again, like pursuing the excellence of technique or in the embetterment of myself, and not training for a particular opponent or a particular match or worrying about winning so that I could, sign a certain contract or whatever it may be. And so then I started finding the passion once again in what I'm doing. But I got to the point where I accepted, like, well, I'm out of the sport, and the guys that I'm training with, they're half my age. But I don't know, find solace in the fact that when I'm on the mat with guys half my age, and I can make most of them look silly still. It's
nice. Good work.
especially when I throw lines out there like, look, man, take it easy on this old man today, and then when you get done grappling, they're like, well, what just happened? You talked about in the Amazon Woman book, the perspective of how you look at things, because you came out with a different perspective at different times. And I think sometimes when I'm grappling, I look at it like that. Like, I still have the ability to keep up with these younger guys, and most people can't at my age,
And I mean, there is a lot to be said for experience and wisdom, and just, having a lot of experience backing you up. So.
Absolutely. I'm sure with you on the river and your experience, you have to be able to there has to be expert kayakers that are in their 20s, but given the experience that you have the ability to read a line in a river and predict and understand how things are moving at a more more efficiently than they are, so that when you actually hit that rapid or that line that you're going down, that you can run this thing way more efficiently than them, to use the same word again.
Yeah, no, I think that is true. Yeah. What I might lack in youth and strength, I definitely can make up for with experience, technique, and all that kind of stuff. And so it does work out, and it's fun to be with a lot of young people because they keep me young, and
Absolutely.
It's, I can share whatever little bit of knowledge I've learned over the last quarter century with them.
Quarter century. Don't say it like that. That's so
I know,
bad.
it sounds bad.
That's so bad. That's so bad. Well, that's what I'm saying. So, if you change your perspective on this and you're just like, you know what, I'm just going to make these 22-year-olds look silly on these rapids today. I came down that line in I don't know, 9 seconds. It took you 15. What happened? How come you got stuck in that little hydraulic there or whatever? There
you go.
So yeah, you got to razz them up.
Good use of the terminology, by the way.
Listen, I had to educate myself on this because so I'll tell you, my career, my kayaking career goes something like this. I ran a travel show for a while where I traveled around and recruited mixed martial arts talent. And it was really a cool show because I had a production team that I work with. You actually met Grace. She brought you in, and she's somebody that worked with me on the show. And like, we operated like a family, but we traveled all over the place. And we pretty much was like, okay, we're going to recruit this athlete. What story do we want to tell? And sometimes it would be hiking to some, I don't know, Buddhist temple in the middle of a jungle somewhere. Sometimes we might be jumping off of waterfalls. But one time we were in New Zealand and we decided that we were going to go kayaking. Now, what I lack in skill, I make up for in stupidity sometimes. And so we decided that we were going to, I can't remember the Tongariro. I'm saying this improperly. You might know the name of the river that comes. It's in New Zealand. It comes out of it connects into Lake Taupo.
The Kaituna?
No, it's the Tongariro River. I think it starts with
okay.
a T.
No.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we were going to go down there and we were going to kayak. And I said, guys, like, I'll try, depending on, I had been whitewater rafting a couple times. I'm like, so depending on what class rapids we're dealing with, I'll give it a try. I'm like, but even my co-host, I'm like, I'm not sure he's going to be able to handle this as well as me, even if things go awry. And so we decided to go to there's a training center in Auckland where they can mimic the rapids with the hydraulic pieces that move up and down. And they can recreate like anything from class 1 to class 5 rapids in this thing. And they also have a 12-foot waterfall drop off. So we started off like, okay, well, let's give this a try. And we started off with some like class 1, class 2, and we had the bigger, the like inflatable kayaks that are, So we started with those to make it a little bit easier. And then finally they bumped it like that. We were able to kind of manage through, and then they got it with a class 3, and it was just, it was a wreck. Like, I'm not experienced in this sport at all. And for the first time in my life, I was the voice of reason that said, like, guys, I don't think it's smart of us to get on this river and try doing this. And so we decided to do these 4-man rafts instead. It was unfortunate because when we got to the river, actually the water levels were low and the rapids were pretty calm, and we more than likely could have handled it, especially on the inflatable kayaks that way. But nonetheless, it was a good learning experience of learning to be humble, at least in a controlled situation rather than actually in a river.
Right. It is good. I mean, kayaking is such a weird sport too. It's so many elements that you can't really control in a certain, like, I mean, you need a lot of practice and experience to be able to do harder whitewater, obviously, but it's also like a very strange mental thing because most other sports, if you need to stop for a second at any time, you can do that. And in kayaking, you kind of have to get really good before you can catch a little eddy and be able to stop. And it's just such an out of control feeling that it's a hard one to just jump in and be able to do hard whitewater.
When I was reading your book, I kind of likened it to rock climbing a little bit, in the sense that, and I'm not an avid rock climber, but I've done enough to know that it's similar. You pick your line when you're going, and you have to actually study it. And you'll see guys like they're like doing this in the gym, like they're mapping out the line that they're taking rock climbing, and you can, once again, in the middle of a climb, you can rest, but it's almost like you have to be good enough to know how to rest in a position with a certain hold or something. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's just, it felt very similar to me. And that's why I think, like, when I was reading your book, I could kind of somewhat relate to it in that sense. Not that it's very technical anyway for the readers. Actually, I was quite surprised at all the other stuff that was in the book as well.
Yes. When I first, when I wrote the first draft of the book, some people that read it were like, okay, this is basically crap. Nobody cares about kayaking the Amazon in terms of like a general interest topic. So you need to put more of yourself, your story into this. And that was really hard for me to do because I'm shy. I don't like talking about myself. But once I did it, I could see that it did make the book a lot more interesting, and it would appeal to people that weren't kayakers or that didn't care about kayaking the Amazon. So
this is what happened. I'm in the book. I'm reading the book. I don't know how many chapters I'm in, maybe 5-6 chapters. And you tell the story at the beginning when Midge gets stuck in the hydraulic. Mm-hmm. I was certain that with everything you had to deal with in this river, that somebody, well, I'm just going to stop there because I don't want to ruin it for anybody else. But I'll just say this, that I then, midway through your book, saw an interview of you on Good Morning America, and it kind of like, and they showed a picture, and I was like, son of a gun, now I know the end. And so, but I'll put it this way, you had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. And so it was like your storytelling is really well. So I don't know if for someone who's not a good, self-hype person, you did a great job telling the stories, because it was, I mean, at least for me, it wasn't like the book's not all about kayaking. Actually, very little of it is about kayaking. A lot of it is about the human factor of everything else that goes into the trip.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I feel much more comfortable doing it in writing than doing it talking in person. It's somehow just a more comfortable medium for me. And writing the book was it was a huge challenge, but I really enjoyed it. It was so far outside of my normal wheelhouse and learning all kinds of new stuff, like what a literary agent was and the fact that I needed one to get a publisher. So it was a great journey in itself.
Darcy's an amazing kayaker, and you kayaked the entire Amazon River, source to sea, and I didn't even realize what that meant until I started reading the book. So, what for the listeners, kind of give the general outline of the story. You did this in 2013.
Yeah, 2013, and the goal was to kayak from the longest source of the Amazon, which is the Montaro River in Peru. And we went even a little bit further than that because we traced the little feeder streams of the Montaro up to a lake. We paddled across this lake and then hiked up a mountainside on the far side, looking for the highest elevation flowing water that we could find. And it was too narrow to kayak. I mean, it was literally like 3 inches wide up there. So we hiked down, then we started kayaking at the lake. And then we kayaked for 148 days all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in Brazil. And halfway through, it was 1 month of whitewater. So we had whitewater kayaks for that month. And then we switched into sea kayaks for the last 4 months of flat water.
That's a long time to just be rowing and rowing.
It is a long time.
So
it's also a long time to be stuck with the same 3 people.
Yeah.
or two other people. There was three of us total. So it was intense exposure.
So, when you guys started up in the Andes, and you told one story about your socks, the socks and the shoes freezing and trying to put them back on, and because you couldn't get them defrosted, so you're like, well, I'll just try to put these on my feet and see if I can defrost them out. So what was the average temperature, like daytime, nighttime temperature, when you were up in the Andes at that point?
And so we started at over 15,000 feet in elevation, and up there, it got pretty warm during the day if the sun was out, like I would say probably mid 60s. And at night, we didn't have a thermometer with us, but in order to freeze the water bottle solid, it must have been in the 20s, I would say.
Yeah.
And then it was about a week of that cold of temperatures. And then we got into where things wouldn't freeze at night, but it's probably getting down to 35 or 40 degrees. And then by the time the whitewater was over, it was just quite hot, like what you would typically think of for Amazon temperatures.
Was there actual whitewater in the cold portion of the water at that point?
There was, luckily it wasn't the hardest whitewater. There was some class 3 up there where it was super cold. And by the time we had like 15 days of this canyon that was class 5 and 5+. And by the time we had gotten there, it was much warmer, which was nice. It still wasn't hot, but we weren't dealing with frozen socks in the morning during the hardest whitewater.
What about when you're actually rafting though? Because you're coming through this water. I would imagine that even if it got up in 60 degrees at the elevation at that point, once you start hitting rapids and that water splashing you, that water still has to be just slightly above freezing water still.
Yeah, it is. It's quite cold, but we were wearing dry suits, and we were also working quite hard. So while we were going, it was pretty easy to stay warm because, we were moving, we were doing physical exertion, and it was pretty easy to stay warm. But as soon as we would stop for the night and get ready to set up camp, like as soon as we stopped moving, it got cold quite quickly. So we'd want to change into dry clothes, get in the sleeping bags, just kind of eat while sitting in the sleeping bags and get covered up as quickly as we could.
And so this was you, Don, and Midge. I forget Midge's name.
David Midgley is his real name, and he goes by Midge. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just ask you this: after reading the book, are you all still friends?
Well,
I know you and Don are because you're running Small World Adventures. But do you guys you still talk to Midge?
Me and Don are still together. Midge was kind of pissed off about the book. But I did, I asked him if he wanted me to change his name or if there was any part of it he couldn't live with. And he said no to both of those things, but he did say he was hurt by the book. But we still, stay in as much contact as we did before the trip, which honestly wasn't much. So for people that don't know the story, the Amazon trip was Midge's idea, and he was not a kayaker when he thought of the idea. So he started coming to Ecuador so that Don and I could teach him to become an expert kayaker so he could kayak the whitewater and the flat water. And so we had very much a guide client or instructor client relationship for a decade while he was training. And it's not like he would ever get in contact except when he needed to book a trip or book some instruction. And now we touch base every year on the anniversary of when we finished and on his birthday. And I'd say that's pretty consistent with our contact before the trip. So,
I guess I could see why Midge might be a little upset by the book because, I'll just say you were pretty forthcoming with all your details, but you were so with yourself as well. I mean, you were very vulnerable with fears that you had, not just fears of the river, but just things that you were dealing with life and concerns. And, you talked about, like, one big portion of the book was you talking about going on this trip and being afraid that you weren't investing in retirement 401k and going against the grain of society and all your friends and people having kids. And it's just something I could relate to because I chose not to have children in life. And so when you go against the grain of society, everybody questions you, like, well,
right.
What are you going to do when you're older and this and that? And you start like, what am I going to do? And so there was a lot of vulnerability on your half as well. It's not like you made yourself look like Miss Amazing and everybody else was.
Yeah, I tried to be equally mean to all three of us was my goal.
That's a great way to put it, actually. Yeah. But you did. You succeeded in that goal at least.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I wanted to be honest. It was, again, people pointed out that, at one point my publisher said, like, oh, it's, we don't mean it this way, Darcy, but it's kind of unfortunate nobody died or nothing majorly went wrong because the story is just kind of boring when everyone succeeds and it's all happy. So I wanted to, they were kind of wondering what was the biggest point of conflict. And it really was dealing with ourselves on a trip that long and dealing with each other. And so I wanted to put, as much as that in without hopefully being too annoying about it. And I wanted to be honest about what we went through, because it is, I didn't realize this before the trip, but I realized during the trip that the group dynamics and the managing like our own mental and emotional states on a trip that long was like far more challenging than the physical challenges of kayaking down the Amazon.
Yeah. It seemed like, especially with the 1 month, like when you hit that series of class fives, it feels like I'm off topic here, but when you hit that series of class fives that you were talking about, and that was through all the construction zones and whatnot, those areas, when you hit that series of class fives, was that pretty much a month of just straight class five the whole time?
It was. So the whitewater lasted a month, and it was a little bit nice. It started out pretty easy and it kind of gradually built up. So we had, like 10 days of warm up, so to speak, before we hit the 15 days of the hardest part. But when we were in the hardest part in the canyon, we were kayaking like 8 to 10 hours a day. So it was very taxing physically and mentally. But, in some ways, that was like the best time for our group because we had this external threat of the whitewater. And we really had to work together. We had to, just focus on getting all three of us through there in one piece. And that was honestly, even though it was the most physically challenging part of the trip, it was probably the best part for our group dynamics, I would say.
After all that whitewater ended, then you said, what was it, 4 months then on
4 months,
still water. And so then you're just dealing with each other the whole time because it's just left side, right side, left side, right side the whole time.
And it was, the flat water ended up being less boring than I thought that it was going to be, because there was plenty of logistical challenges. And then eventually we hit the tides that come up from the Atlantic Ocean and winds and pretty big waves caused by the wind and the tide. So it was more challenging than I thought, but it still was quite boring. And when we didn't have any reason to bond and be a team and try to help each other survive, it was just so much easier to kind of turn all our angst inward and just fight with each other. And we really had to work hard to not let that kind of take over.
But let me ask you, why? I mean, why is that angst happen? Because you guys knew what you were getting at. Like, you knew what was going to happen. You knew the river, you studied the river before, and you knew that you were going to have this long stretch. So, going into something, like, okay, I'm going to have 4 months of just on a sea kayak, just paddling, and it's going to be arduous and boring. And everybody knew that going in. So how does the problem arise?
I think two answers to this question. One, we knew that, but it's hard to, when you're sitting at home planning, it's hard to really understand what it's going to be like once you're out there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is we all three of us had the same goal, which was to get to the Atlantic Ocean. And that was good. We were united in that front, but we all had like very different ways that we would accomplish this goal. And we didn't do a very good job of communicating about that beforehand. So a lot of the frustration came up for me, mainly because I thought that Midge was paddling too slow. And I know that sounds totally dumb to say it right now, but we were like 1 month into the flat water and he decided he only wanted to kayak 6 hours a day. And it turns out he had a good reason. And that was that he was really worried about getting an overuse injury like tendonitis or something else. But he just didn't communicate that until a couple weeks into this 6-hour schedule. So, me and Dawn are just like, oh, we're kind of in this dangerous area. Why are we spending so much time sitting around on these sand beaches, kind of being vulnerable to attacks or robberies when we could be paddling? And, it's just a little bit of a lack of communication at a certain point. And I think that, once we finally figured out everybody's motivation, it got a lot easier, but there was definitely some frustrating times when it's like, why is Midge doing this? And I'm sure he felt like, why is Darcy being so annoying and trying to get me to paddle more? She doesn't understand what I'm going through. But a little communication went a long way, which also sounds like duh saying it now, but it was not so easy to figure that out in the moment.
when you talk about planning this thing from home and it's difficult to see everything that goes into it, when you're sitting planning things, like you can say, okay, this is going to take me 4 months, this section here. So I have to be prepared for this, mentally prepared for it. But the X factors that you don't think about are things like the mosquitoes you guys had to deal with. You talked about like sand fleas. You talked about the muscle cramping from the stabilization of the sea kayaks and all the scraping, like how beat up your bodies were. If you could choose to eliminate like one of those external factors, just one of them, whether it be the mosquitoes or whatever, which one would you have gotten rid of? Like, which one was the worst?
I would say the sand flies were the worst. And, while we were kayaking, they weren't bad at all, but they kind of ruled every second of camp life, including like we would have to try to set our alarms to get up before it got light, because they would mostly go away at night and they were really bad during the day. But like try to be all done going to the bathroom before it got light out and the sandflies came out, for example. And that was one of those little things. Like the other physical problems somehow seemed more manageable, but that one the sandflies were able to drive us more crazy and piss us off more than anything else.
Can you give a PG version of what it's like going to the bathroom with sandflies? Like I'm kind of curious, because like I'll just say this: if we're going to the bathroom, like you're probably squatting and I'm standing, and I'm sure that might make a difference. I don't know.
It does make a difference, except when you have to go poop, then you also have to squat down. So yes, basically the sand flies, anytime you expose any bit of skin, they will find it, including like your earlobes, anything they will go after if you let some skin out. So going to the bathroom, yes, you obviously have to expose a lot of skin and get pretty close to the sand. And so it's very uncomfortable. I don't know if you've ever been bit by sandflies, but they're like extremely itchy bites.
Yeah.
And so having them on your butt and other places when you're going to be sitting in the kayak all day is very unpleasant.
I guess that's about as PG as you could possibly make it. How high can sandflies travel from the sand then? Like if you're standing, do you have the same problem?
Well, yeah, they bite elbows and earlobes while you're standing.
Okay,
so they do
right.
get up there a bit, but if you're walking around on a beach, for sure, like we call them ankle biters because your ankles are much more likely to get bit, but they do fly up, 5 or 6 feet, I would say.
And this stinks because you've had like a long day of kayaking. Of course, that's slowed down for you. I would imagine that the physical output on the still water wasn't nearly as bad because Midge slowed down, and and you're not burning as many calories. Like I was thinking about this when you talked about your caloric intake. You're also burning calories mentally when you're fighting those class 5, like the amount of mental focus that it takes burns a tremendous amount of calories, I'm sure, on top of your physical output as well. But that all dropped for the 4 months that you guys were on the still water. What do you call that water? What's the
flat water?
Flat water. Okay.
Yeah,
the flat water.
Yeah, it was a lot easier for a lot of reasons to keep up with our calorie needs on the flat water, because in the white water we were limited by how much weight we could carry in our kayaks, and it was pretty hard to get resupplies because there was only, once we entered the class 5 canyon, there was only 2 road access points, and so we had to basically not eat enough because we just couldn't carry enough weight. And we're, like you said, doing a huge physical and mental output. And then on the flat water, both the physical and the mental were diminished quite a bit. And there was so many towns that we could stop and resupply. And I'm vegan, so it was a little bit harder for me to find stuff, but most of the time I could find food to augment the dehydrated meals. And almost always Dawn and Midge could find, like, people would motor up in their canoes and sell them fish and things like that. So yeah, just the food needs became a lot less of a worry once we hit the flat water.
How difficult was it? I knew you were vegan. How difficult was it for you to find food in those areas? Because in the book you talked about meeting some of the local villagers, the indigenous people, and having to kind of explain, like, I can't eat this. At one point you felt like you're like, well, I'm going to eat this anyway, and then I felt like a complete jerk.
Yeah, that was in Brazil, where I speak pretty good Spanish because of working in Ecuador, but don't speak great Portuguese. And the story that you're talking about, these people had let us, like, out near the tidal zone of the Amazon, there's not really beaches and flat ground anymore. It's like mud flats and mangrove swamps. So we always had to camp on someone's docks. Like, people built their homes on stilts and connected everyone's house via boardwalks. And so we were camping with this family, and they were so nice, and they were trying to offer us cake because they had a wedding party the night before. And I had like written down a translation in Portuguese of how to explain that I was vegan and thank you very much, but I'm just not going to eat that. And then they were like, do you want a fruit salad? And I was like, oh, sure, that sounds great. And they go back and get a fruit salad. And then they had put a ton of like whipped cream on top. So then I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't eat this either because the cream, vegan. And then finally they just brought back a bowl of acai berries, and that they were vegan, but they had the way that everyone does it there, the acais, they pick them and then they soak them in river water to loosen up the skin.
Yeah.
And I knew that it was probably like not the best thing to eat from a health standpoint, but I was like, you know what? I've been so rude to these people not eating any of the other food they offer. Like, this really is vegan. I'm just going to risk the gastrointestinal problems, which I didn't have any, luckily.
Good on you, because I'll tell you, I've had food poisoning, I would say probably 3 times that I've been to countries like Indonesia where you can't consume tap water. And the last time I was there, I was at this restaurant and I got a carrot juice. And when I was drinking the carrot juice, as I drank it, it clicked in my mind like, oh, this tastes like this is kind of watery for carrot juice. And it did, like, I've traveled enough internationally to know at this point in time, but for whatever reason, it didn't click. And I drank the whole carrot juice. And then fortunately, it didn't kick in until I got off the plane back in Singapore. And I got home and suddenly my stomach was like, no.
Oh, no.
And then I was sick for like the next day and a half, just purging everything because they had taken my carrot juice and pretty much watered it down. I'm assuming with tap water, half of it. And you have to be really careful of that kind of stuff when you're out of the country, particularly in these kind of situations. Yeah. So I was actually impressed at how dedicated you were to your vegan lifestyle. Particularly, I was thinking you're in a situation where your very survival could depend on the fact that if somebody was just like, here, eat a steak, and you're like, this will give you the energy to get through these rapids you need to get through. And you're like, nope, I'm vegan. If I die on the rapids and I die on the rapids, like I'm not going to eat this steak. And I was like, kudos to you for that.
No, it is kind of like a religion to me in the sense that I can't explain super well why I'm so hardcore about wanting to stick with it. But I don't necessarily feel like I would rather die than eat meat, but it's very close to that. And hold on. Just for
the record, you were in your book, you were talking about feeling guilty for killing mosquitoes. Like, I'm sorry, but it's like, I would have been like, Darcy, here, I'll go ahead and take her, give me her meat, like there, I'll take her serving. And and you're like, and meanwhile, I'm like, here, you can have my mosquitoes too.
I know. It is a little crazy, but once the mosquitoes start trying to bite me, then all bets are off and I'll squish them. Oh. But I still feel bad.
Okay. Murderer.
I know, exactly.
All right. Well, so you're on this trip and a lot of it becomes arduous, but talk about, let's back up. Let's talk about some of the human factor that you had to deal with. So when you're coming through these class 5 rapids, like you're dealing with a lot of the construction zones that are going through there. And you were talking about dynamite. You talked about the dump truck being stuck in the river at one point in time. That itself was creating a pretty extreme rapid, correct? That you guys had to negotiate.
Yeah. So we in the Whitewater section, we paddled through this canyon where they're building a new dam on the Montaro River, and it's a really inaccessible canyon, like probably 1,000 foot tall or more cliff walls. And so they had been doing a lot of dynamite work to build a road down to the river on both sides of the river. And so they were dynamiting, everything from small rocks to rocks the size of school buses and houses were like laying in the river. And so a lot of the rapids were unrunnable because the water would just then go underneath all these new rocks they had blown into the river. And there's just like no physical way to survive in a kayak. And then at one point there was a huge dump truck lying in the river that, presumably fell off the cliff in some mishap in dynamite work. I don't know what happened, but it was creating, like, kayakers call them sieves or siphons, like a rock pile or a pile of wood where the water gets through, but a kayaker would not. And this dump truck was obstructing part of the river where, a lot of current was going into it, where if we would have hit it, we would have just kind of got swept underneath it and probably stayed there forever. And so this was, still in 25 years of kayaking, the scariest day of kayaking that I've ever had, just because it was such an unnatural riverbed. And portaging, walking around the rapids was also quite challenging because the banks were just all this super loose debris from their dynamite work. So you'd take a step and things above you would start sliding down. And so it was kind of this situation where being on land wasn't safe, being in the river wasn't safe. And on top of that, we had negotiated with the construction company 3 hours of them stopping their dynamite work. But because we had to do some portaging and use rope works to get around some of the rapids, it had taken us like already 5 hours at a certain point. We still hadn't seen any construction workers. So I got really sort of paranoid that they were gonna, since we hadn't seen them, I assumed they hadn't seen us, and they might think, okay, it's been 3 hours, let's just get back to work. And if they had done it, it would have been very disastrous for us if they had started dynamiting more rocks down on top of us at that point. But obviously I'm here, so they didn't do that, and it worked out all right. But it took us 8 hours altogether that day to get through there, and it was 8 of the most stressful hours of my life.
Well, surely they didn't hit the dynamite because of the OSHA regulations or whatever they had for.
Right.
Was it the dump truck is where Midge got stuck?
No, it was just a little ways after the dump truck, and it was this huge rapid that there was no way to portage, but we were able to climb out and get a view of it. And there was a huge hole or hydraulic, like going across about 95% of the river. And there was one little, we call it a tongue of water, but one little path on the far right side of the river to get past the hole. And Midge just didn't make it over there all the way. He was close. He was within like 2 feet of making it to the safe passage, but he didn't quite make it, and he fell into that hole. And
you had contemplated at that point in time, like, can I save him? And you decided like it's not possible.
So this hole was at the top of a really long rapid, and then we could see an eddy on the right side at the bottom, and an eddy is like a calm spot where you could stop. But beyond that eddy, we couldn't see. And we could see that there was more whitewater and more canyon, but we didn't know how bad it was or what it was. And so Don went first, and he had caught the eddy, and then me, and then Midge. And Midge was in the hole, and I went down to the eddy, and we have this conversation about, all right, if he has to get out of his kayak and swim, we don't know if we can chase him because it might be another unrunnable rapid downstream of us. So let's do what we can, but we have to be prepared to let him go. If it's a matter of Midge is going to go into this potentially unrunnable rapid, or all 3 of us trying to save him, we have to be mentally prepared to let him go.
And how many days into the trip was this?
This was probably about 20 days in.
Pretty early, you're already like, bye, Midge.
Yes. And it wasn't a thing of like, oh, we don't like you, so we're not going to try to save you. It was a real conversation about one of us dying is better than all 3 of us dying.
Yeah.
So I'm probably sounding like a horrible person right now, but it wasn't as bad as it might be coming across. It's one of those situations of you got to look out for the rescuer first to not create more.
No, you actually covered it in your book quite well. The way that you talked about it was like, because you kind of mentally exhausted every possible option in your head of how you could manage to pull him out with all 3 of you guys surviving. And you kind of come to the conclusion that if we do this, then the chances of any of us living is nearly 0%.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That is a great way to put it. Thank you.
Yeah. You see, you should have had me edit your book before you put this thing out. Then I could have taken all your shortcomings or whatever and turned them into some positives, perhaps. I don't know. Euphemistically reworded them. I'll put it that way.
There you go. That's good.
You obviously have the dangers of the river, but what was interesting to me, and I'm sure will be interesting to a lot of the readers, is the human factor that you had to deal with externally, like all those kinds of dangers. Because in the book you talked about river pirates, you talked about the red zone with the narcos, you had the dynamite, you had these companies that were pushing you through, like they didn't want to wait. You're cutting into profit margins for them. But it was so bad that you got to the point where you had your hair, you cut your hair so that you looked like a boy. In essence, you were actually mistaken for one at one point in time on the river, because you were so paranoid about the fact that you could, be killed or raped or whatever. because of all these external factors. Was that more, I mean, I know the threat was real, but do you think that in your head you kind of hyped that up a bit, or was this all legitimate concern? Because at some points Midge seemed real just chill about the fact that you guys are in a narco zone.
For sure, I got more worried than I needed to be in hindsight, because everyone was super nice to us. We had nothing but good experiences. But this place right where the flatwater ended, right where the whitewater ended and the flatwater started, it's this place that Peru calls the Red Zone, where it's the #1 cocaine producing region of the world now, actually. There's tons of illegal logging, and people can get like $11,000 for a single big tree. So it's worth killing people and doing lots of illegal stuff to get these trees out. There's Shining Path insurgents left over from Peru's civil war.
Explain real quick what the Shining Path insurgents are for people that don't know.
So in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was like a Maoist uprising in Peru. And it was supposed to be an uprising of the poor to overthrow kind of the wealthy bureaucrats in Lima and to take control back for the poor people of Peru. But the whole movement devolved, and it ended up with all these Shining Path soldiers like killing poor people first in the highlands of Peru, and then they moved down into the Amazon regions where we were, and they killed like a third of the indigenous population there. They're called the Ashanika people. They like enslaved them to make them fight for the cause, and those who wouldn't, they killed. And it was a very traumatic time for the country, and especially for poor people in both the highlands and the jungle region. And it's mostly over now, but there are still sort of soldiers out there that call themselves Shining Path, and they mainly work for the drug trade now or for the illegal loggers, but they still exist. And in fact, the Peruvian military killed 2 Shining Path leaders like 12 miles from where we were camped one night as we were getting close to the flatwater. And then there's all those factors. And there's the Ashanika people, who are the local indigenous people, who understandably are afraid of all these drug traffickers and loggers and Shining Path people coming into their territory, and they don't get any backup from like the military or the local police. So they've just taken their safety into their own hands. And in the 2 years before our expedition, like we knew of 6 tourists that had passed through this area, and 2 of them were murdered, and 1 more guy was shot. And they were killed by the Ashanika people, not again out of malice, I don't believe, just out of them trying to protect themselves because they didn't understand what these people were trying to do, basically. And so bad stuff had happened. So I think there was good reason to be afraid. And I think I got overly paranoid about it both, if that makes sense. And yeah, like we all had to worry about getting killed. But of course, as a woman, I worried about things like getting raped and just sort of being perceived as weak, I guess. And so the reason I cut off all my hair, I was like, okay, maybe if people think that we're 3 dudes, they'll be less likely to mess with us. And
because 5'4" dudes are real common.
Exactly.
Right. Like
they are in South America.
Or at 5'4", 120 pounds, they're like, oh, that's, I don't know. Maybe you could have been mistaken for a teenage boy, perhaps.
But I think, who knows what people thought from a distance while we were paddling. Maybe they did think we were 3 guys, but whenever we stopped to talk to people and I started talking, I think it really made them feel more at ease once they figured out that I was a woman. And that was a really interesting dynamic to watch, because they were just as scared of us as we were of them. And then when I would start talking, you could just sort of see like this different level of comfort, and they would relax a little bit and like, oh, okay, what are you guys doing? What do you, and so that was kind of a cool thing to see.
Because you talked about when I think it was the Ashanika people, when you met one of the village elders there, and you were on that dock and asking whether or not you could camp, and you guys had your kayaks, and he had to check your website to see that this was actually legit, because he said that they had a concern for white people, for fear that white people would come and steal their children for organ harvesting. Like that's a legitimate concern of theirs. Yeah,
we got stopped by a group of Ashanika, and they were kind of listing all these things that they were fearful of from outsiders, and like the drug trade, the logging, and we had heard that this was something that the people believe, but he said white people come and kidnap our children and harvest their organs. And it was really interesting hearing from him that was something they were afraid of. And probably these fears come about because like Franciscan missionaries did come take a lot of indigenous children away and put them in special camps trying to, remove them from their culture and
Indoctrinate
change
them
their
into
religion. Exactly. And so I'm sure part of it comes from that. But yeah, I mean, you don't want to be seen as someone who's out to kidnap children and steal their organs. And that is how they saw us. And once we realized that, we could then do everything in our power to, try to convince them that was not our goal.
Yeah, in reading your book, so I've done quite a bit of travel, but I've not done very much travel in South America. Been to Brazil a couple times, and the travel that I've done, I've actually kind of like this, not as extreme as this in the sense of getting off the beaten path, so to speak. But I've been in places in Myanmar where we're just miles from a rebel border, and so I understand these threats at some level, and the dynamic that plays there. Because as I was reading your book, I kind of began to understand what was going on, because the Shining Path movement starts. Then when the movement starts to lose its momentum, so to speak, you have what ends up happening is like you have Pablo Escobar, who is now killed, and the drug trade, 75% of the drug trade moves to Peru, where they're supplying 75% of the coca to the United States, of the cocaine. So then there's this built-in use for the Shining Path people who are no longer fighting to overthrow the government, but now protecting the narcos, and I would imagine they probably help protect other illegal businesses there as well, like the logging and construction zones and anything, threatening anybody that would create that would ruffle the feathers of these things going on. So the dynamic of this entire situation truly is, although you never directly ran into something like that, threat is there. It's legit the entire time.
Yeah, it's totally legit. And there had been, a couple different Ashanika leaders who had gone to the police to speak out about illegal logging on their land. And the loggers, and maybe, with the help of the Shining Path, the loggers had basically done public execution of these leaders, like at the soccer field in front of their town. And so there is, it is a violent place, and people do get murdered, and there are plenty of risks with trusting outsiders, basically, or having any interaction with outsiders.
Yeah, this is this is a very volatile situation. So you guys prove your credentials to the Ashanika, but who was it when they started this? A funny story when they started talking about the punishment was it Carlos? What was his name? Cesar.
Yes.
He had to be punished for letting you guys. So listen, you actually do a great job of telling the story in your book. So please tell it for everybody listening.
What we ended up doing was getting permission letters from like this overarching body of the Ashanika people. And those letters serve to explain what we were doing to people. So they wouldn't see us as a threat. Okay, they're just kayakers, they're just paddling through. And we had designated spots that we had to check in to present these letters, show our passports, all that stuff. And we paddled past this little village, maybe we only saw about 20 people, but it was not one of the official checkpoints. And they start waving us over, and it's Saturday, and I don't know if this is true or not, but everyone says that people drink a lot on Saturdays. And so we kind of are thinking, all right, maybe they'll be drunk. They might want to mess with us. Let's just not stop, because it's not one of the official checkpoints. And we're paddling and not very fast in our kayaks. And we can just see them getting more and more sort of agitated and angry that we're not stopping. And this is in the red zone. So we had also hired an Ashanika guy to follow along with us in a motorized canoe to help with uncomfortable situations like this one. And him and the Ashanika guy and another guy named Cesar were in the canoe together, but they were nowhere to be seen. So we just decided, okay, we're going to pretend like we don't know what's going on, and we're just going to keep kayaking. But they're getting pretty pissed off. And finally, Cesar in the canoe shows up, and they go talk to the Ashanika people, and then they come talk to us, and they're like, you need to go back. They're really pissed that you didn't stop. And we're like, do you think it's safe? Are we just going to paddle back to get shot, or what's going on? They're like, no, I think it's safe. Go back. So we turn around, we kayak back up. And this is when we are getting the lecture about all the things they have to be worried about.
I can only imagine in your head at this point in time, you're like, I'm just paddling to my impending doom here. Like, I don't know why. I should just take my chances to continue going down the river, at least, because I'm 100% assured I'm dying here. 50-50 if I go down the river that they can catch me type of thing.
Yeah. So the Peruvian government armed the Ashanika with these 1950s Israeli shotguns to help. So the Ashanika could help fight against the Shining Path in the 1980s, the late 1980s. And they still have these 1950 shotguns. So totally we're thinking like, okay, great. We're just paddling back so we can get within range of their old crappy shotguns. But anyway, we paddle back and we get a lecture about, again, the gringos that want to come steal the children and all the things that they have to be worried about. And then once the guy was sort of content that we understood all the threats, he said, okay, well, we're not mad at you guys because you didn't know, you're foreigners, you don't know the rules here. You didn't know you had to stop. But Cesar, who's like your guide, he should have known. And so we need to punish him. And meanwhile, some of the other guys were walking around, like grabbing our GoPro cameras and our spot device and asking what they were and telling us to turn them off. And so we're all sort of me, Don, and Midge are kind of trying to quietly talk between ourselves. Like, what do you think punishment means? What are they going to do? And we're just really expecting the worst at this point because we're thinking of these two other people that have been murdered and this one other guy who's been shot. And then
by
finally
the way, in the book, I'm picturing a scene like that of Jesus Christ being, like held down, and then with the, the cat nine tails and leather with little metal pieces on the end of, like, I'm picturing something like this. I was like, this is not good.
Yeah, I mean, the worst form of torture you can think of. Yeah, so we're like, what's going to happen? And then, so the Ashanika speak Ashanika as their first language, and Spanish as their second language. We speak Spanish as a second language. And then the guy says, all right, he goes, this is going to be the punishment. And he uses this word that in slang in Ecuador means push-ups, but it also means to iron or grill something is like the actual proper usage. So then me and Dawn are like conferring again. We're like, do you think they mean push-ups or are they going to like grill him? What's going to happen? And then very quickly, everyone started laughing. And what the chief had said was that your punishment for Cesar was to do 50 push-ups. And then the chief was like, can you do 50 push-ups? And Cesar was like, yes, I was Peruvian military. I can do 50 push-ups, no problem. So he gets down and starts doing push-ups and everyone comes out and is watching and cheering him on. And he only was able to do 49 push-ups, but the chief let him off anyways, and with a comment about how weak the Peruvian military were.
on the entire 4 months that you guys are on the flat water, is all the indigenous people that you run into, are they all Ashanika or are there other tribes along the way?
Yeah, lots of other tribes. It was a real mixture of, Peruvians, Brazilians, and then different indigenous tribes kind of all mixed together. And the Ashanika were in the red zone and then a little bit further downriver. And then, after that, it was just a real mixture of all kinds of different peoples and cultures.
So you didn't have to get, I'm assuming on that portion of the river, then tourism is a bit more, it's a bit more common.
So yeah, that was sort of a funny thing. Like there's no tourists in the red zone whatsoever. And at one of the villages, one of the official checkpoints, we went to have a beer with kind of the leader of that town. And then there was an engineer visiting town, and he wanted to know like how they could bring tourism into the red zone, which was cool that was something they wanted to do. But, it was sort of a weird, delicate conversation of how do you say like, well, stop killing tourists and then maybe more will come here. But, to try to explain that it does have this sort of very scary reputation. But anyway, so yeah, no tourists basically whatsoever besides us in the red zone. And then once we got down to Iquitos and Manaus, there is more tourism, but a lot of it is like people fly into one of those destinations, gets on a boat and goes up to do a jungle tour. And then there's some backpacker tourists that would get on like the ferry boats where everyone hangs their hammocks and cruise up and down the river. But that has gotten just a lot more dangerous, especially in Brazil. There's just like so many gangs and so much drug trade and those river boats. The local people are very afraid to take them because there's so much incidents of robbery and rape from these different gangs. And so that was really kind of a sad thing in Brazil. It's just this real, everyone seemed to be afraid of everyone. And that's where we had the problem of trying to convince people to let us camp because they were worried that we were there to rob them or kill them. And what it always took for us was finding someone with a smartphone to like put in our website so they could see what we were doing. And once they saw that, they were always super nice, but it took a lot of convincing to like get through to them. They're like, no, we don't want to rob you. We don't want to kill you. We just want to sleep here for the night. And it was, people are very fearful of everyone down there.
Yeah. When you talk about the river pirates, like, would they not be fearful of the river pirates? You refer to them as river rats in the book. That's, I guess that's what they call them. Would they not be fearful of these river pirates? Say, for example, if you're sleeping on a dock there, coming in to create havoc in the village and rob you guys, like an external threat factor to something like that.
Yeah, I think it was always sort of a fear, and a lot of different towns would have like guards guarding the town, standing down on the beach with a shotgun, and they would just sort of rotate through and have different guards every night. And I don't know, how effective that is if a boat full of river pirates comes up, but at least give some kind of alarm warning. And, luckily nothing like that happened that we witnessed, but it's, something they prepare for.
All right. So let me ask you this. Like, I'm thinking about going to the Amazon. Like, you have, I mean, this sounds like an amazing idea. Like, hey, let's kayak the Amazon source to sea. We have demolition and dynamite to deal with. We have narcos in the red zone. We have these river pirates. We have indigenous people that could possibly kill us. And then if it's not those things, then we have the annoyances like the mosquitoes and the sandflies. And if it's not those things, then, I don't know, like the river has like 50-foot anacondas, piranha are in the river. There's actually, I was reading, there's actually been bull sharks spotted all the way up in Peru in the river.
Whoa.
And I'm like, and then there's those little parasitic fish. You know the name of those things? The ones that supposedly crawl up in your urethra?
Kangaroo fish.
Yeah. There's vampire fish. Like, this sounds like just an amazing idea all around. Like, you guys are...
what So what you're trying to say is we're not very smart.
Amazing kayakers, but I'm like, I'm even like, I'm an adventure guy, but there's a part of me that's like, I don't know about all that.
Well, it is funny when I started writing my book, it took me much, much longer than I thought it was going to take me. And my mom was like, Darcy, you need to hurry up and finish this book. What if it's taking you so long? What if some other woman goes and does it and she writes a book first? And I was like, Mom, I have pretty much like zero worry about that. I mean, not that another woman couldn't do it. I know there's plenty that could, but it takes a very weird person who's good enough at whitewater kayaking to kayak the whitewater and then still interested in doing 4 months of flat water in dealing with all the other crap that you just laid out. And it's, I mean, I don't know what is wrong with us that made us think that this was something that we thought we would like to do, but it definitely takes a weird person to want to do it.
So, I mean, did you guys run into any bull sharks, piranhas? Did Midge or Don get any of the urethra fish up the pee-pee?
They didn't, but they were always careful to pee away from the water just in case. Apparently there has been one documented case of that happening, but the locals didn't seem all that concerned about it.
I mean, I'm sure the locals surely are. They swim in the water?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can swim. You're just not supposed to pee while you're swimming because the urine apparently attracts these fish. We saw a lot of the fish. There's like up in the red zone, we would always camp at fishing camp. So guys would be fishing all night long and they would catch catfish in their nets. And then the kangaroo fish are parasitic. So they come in and they would like attach to the gills of these fish that were trapped in the nets. And these were big ones, like not going to swim up your urethra, hopefully, but they were kind of scary, gross fish.
Did you watch movies like Anaconda and Piranha to do research for the Amazon?
But a funny thing was like almost at every village, we would be like, hey, is it safe to swim here? Or are the piranhas going to get us? And the locals would always laugh like with that. That was the only response. They would just laugh at us and then say, you guys have been watching way too many American movies. Like you don't have to worry about piranhas. But then they would go tell us about all these things we did have to worry about. They said, shuffle your feet when you go in the water because there's big stingrays. And we did see some rays with like a 6-7 foot wingspan and some other big fish. There were caiman, but we only saw them at night if we'd like shine our flashlights along the banks. And We had really cool animal encounters with like pink Amazonian river dolphins, but
Yeah,
never any bad
I
encounters.
didn't even know that was like when you wrote that. I was like, oh, river dolphin. I
Yeah,
didn't even know it
they're
was
super
a
cool.
yeah.
There's yeah.
And just to expose some of my ignorance, I just learned that what a narwhal was, that it's an actual real animal the other day.
Yeah, those are cool too.
Yeah, like totally. And when I saw it, I was like, no, this has got to be fake. I had no clue. And I'm like, how did I get this far through life not knowing this? So, yeah, but when you were talking about the river dolphins, I was like, well, that's a nice little. Did you actually swim with any of the dolphins? Did you see dolphins on the trip? I can't remember if you just mentioned them or you saw
a ton
them.
of them. So from reading Joe Kane's book called Running the Amazon about the first source to sea, he said they saw a few pink dolphins, but they were going extinct. And that was in 1985. So I was really hoping that we would see one. And we saw our first pink dolphin on day 30 of the trip. And then we saw them every single day until about the last week. And they were very curious. Like, I think our paddle strokes hitting the water, they would swim around us quite a lot. And they were good morale boosters when we were feeling kind of low.
I'll bet. Would they let you touch them?
No, they didn't get that close.
No.
And it was funny. I really think the movement of our paddles is what attracted them, because so often, like, 5 pink dolphins would be around us and we'd put our paddles down and get out the cameras to try to take photos of them. And then they would just disappear. Yeah. But as soon as we'd pack up the camera and start paddling again, then they would come back out. So.
Yeah, I remember one time I was in Monterey, California, and I went whale watching, and I was on this 43-foot sailboat that I actually had rented the sailboat as an Airbnb. And so I'm out there whale watching. The captain of the ship takes us out, and I always said, like, man, if I saw some whales in the ocean, like, I would go swimming with them, like I would jump in. And then when I saw the size of that whale, I was like, nah, I'm good. I'm just gonna. And then they got really close to our boat, and they were like the size, like the length, if not more than our boat. And I was like, there's no way I'm jumping in the water with this thing, even though they're technically gentle animals. I'm just like, one flip of the tail, I scare this thing. Nothing. No, not happening.
Right? You're kidding.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then, because you hit this flat water the whole time, and then finally you start coming to the point where the river is running into the Atlantic. And then this is pretty hectic, the dealing with the tide. I mean, there's tide, but is there rapids there? Like the picture that's on the cover of your book, is that the construction zone picture, or is that where you're starting to meet the Atlantic there?
Yeah, that's in the whitewater sections.
Okay.
And so, yeah, further down, once we hit the flat water, there was truly no more real rapids. But towards the end, it was like constantly windy blowing upriver, and it was just like being in a big lake, so the wind would make these pretty big waves, and then the tides, come up, and they would hit the outgoing tides would hit the waves caused by the wind and make bigger waves. And then kind of the trickiest thing is it got really shallow at places, and there'd be sandbars, and when the sandbars were kind of running down the length of the river, then they would make the waves kind of curl sideways, as opposed to that way, instead of like us paddling straight into the waves were coming at us from the side, and that made things a lot more tricky. So even though there weren't rapids, it got pretty challenging again, and the sea kayaks aren't really designed to handle whitewater quite as well, so it was pretty hard.
Oh yeah, I forgot, because you're on those kayaks. So then how wide because at one point in time you talked about the river being 12.5 miles wide. Like once it starts to actually open up there, how wide does that get?
So the mouth of the Amazon is like over 200 miles wide, and the river that you're talking about, so the last week we were in this big bay called the Para Bay, and it was probably 50 miles wide, and we couldn't see across it. And we were paddling along like the river right side, or the south bank. But then this tributary called the Tocantins River comes in there, and where that river joins the Amazon, that was the crossing we had to do. That was like 12.5 miles just across the mouth of this tributary river.
Gotcha. Okay.
And, but yeah, the last week we could only see the shore that we were paddling along, and we couldn't see the far shore at all.
Yeah, because at one point you talked about not having a place to sleep, and then you guys sat in the water. You sat in the water for 6 hours or whatever, waiting for the tide to roll out so that you could sleep on this rock that would be exposed.
Exactly.
Did you not watch The Shallows with Blake Lively?
No.
Oh God, yeah, it's basically that movie. She gets stuck on a rock and the tide is coming in and then there's a shark and
Oh, I better check it out.
well, I mean, you might as well, because if you'd have checked it out before, actually, I don't know if that movie, I can't remember what year that movie came out. I think it's The Shallows, yeah. And
right.
anyway, yeah, that would have just made you more paranoid because with the bull shark situation as well. Yeah, I don't know. How big of a rock was this? Because I was trying to kind of imagine the size of the three of you guys sleeping on this tiny little rock in the middle of the ocean that gets exposed when the tide rolls out.
So it was pretty big. It was probably like, I don't know, like 5 feet by 10 feet. Kind of. It was definitely a big rock.
Well, when you say big and you talk about the mouth of a river being 12 and a half miles wide, like I was thinking that maybe this thing was like the size of like Long Island or something like that, you know?
Oh no.
Yeah.
No. It was like the size of 2 couches put together, maybe.
Okay, that's fairly small. Couches. That's still there's some drama there. Like I would have worried about drowning when the tide comes in and not being awake or whatever, you know.
Well, it was a basalt piece of rock too, so it was like really jagged, and there was little pools of water with little crabs in them from when the rock had been underwater. But we were all so exhausted. You know, we definitely spent some time like, okay, don't put your head next to that puddle with the crab, but we were just so exhausted by that point. We just rolled out our thermarest, and even though it was like all lumpy and jagged, we were asleep pretty fast. But of course, you know, we only slept for a few hours, and then it's like uncomfortable. So you get back up and sit around. And the worst part about that rock was we woke up at maybe like 4 a.m. the next day, and it was like the tide was coming in. It was low tide at that point. The tide was coming back in, and we were only 10 miles from our ending point at that point. And we were all super enthusiastic to finish, as I'm sure you could imagine. But it was just, we knew that it was useless to try to paddle against the tide. So we just sat on that rock for 5 more hours, like waiting for the tide to finish coming in and go back out. And, you know, we like talk a little bit, but after 5 months together, like conversations was not happening so much. It was just sitting around for 5 hours, waiting.
If you were going to do this again, yeah, I know that's a big if, but what would you do differently? What kind of differences would you make in that would make this more enjoyable? Because there was a lot one of the things I appreciate about your book is the emotional state that you were going through, like the roller coaster. Prior to the trip, you didn't have a really big, like you couldn't answer your why. Like what was your why for doing this? And then at part of the way through the trip, like you had this self-imposed time zone that you put on as well. And so it's like what kind of stuff would you have done differently?
No, I spent just so much in my life I've thought of as physical challenges, you know, and, you know, I listened to your episode with Rob and him talking about how no one believed he was going to be a Navy SEAL and didn't think he could do it. And, you know, I've kind of butted my head against that my whole life too, is people look at me and don't think that I can be a good kayaker or volleyball player, whatever it is. So I've always been sort of out to prove myself in these physical challenges. And I thought of the Amazon in very much the same way. So I spent a lot of time physically preparing for it. And the physical challenges were nothing compared to like the mental and emotional challenges. And so if I was going to do something like that again, I already am much more prepared mentally now. I learned a lot on the Amazon trip about managing my own mental state and managing my like outlook on things and what a huge difference like a little tweak in my own mindset could make to the situation and how I felt about the situation in terms of hating Midge, hating the Amazon and being upset to be there versus a very small change in my outlook could make me very grateful to be there, enjoying everything I was seeing and enjoying the challenge. And so that's my biggest takeaway from the Amazon. And it's been very helpful in normal life because I mean, obviously we had a lot of adversity on the Amazon, but everyone has a lot of adversity in their day-to-day life in kind of any challenge that they pursue. And this Amazon mindset has been enormously helpful moving forward for me and not getting upset about little things and taking challenges in stride, I guess.
Yeah, I'll give you, because there was a lot of the reason why I asked you some of these questions, because I would imagine there are a lot of listeners that kind of deal with similar mindset issues, and even with myself in my career, when I know that I'm getting into something, I'll still have these instances where maybe I thought that I was mentally prepared for something. I was mentally prepared for all the problems that could arise, but when the problems start to arise, then you realize like, oh, I wasn't. So I'll give you a quote from your book, and this is probably one of my favorite lines from your book. It says, life is a perpetual stream of problems. How you choose to react to those problems dictates your happiness. Trying to avoid problems will only get you nowhere. And so that was, kind of my takeaway. Like, yeah, you just can't avoid problems in life. They're going to come at you. So, how you react to them. I'll ask you this final question. Have you ever considered kayaking the Nile?
I'm honestly scared to, because I think of the animal challenges and the human challenges that we faced on the Amazon, I think are magnified on the Nile. And so I've thought about it, but I think it might be too scary.
Well, I'll tell you this much. I had a gentleman on by the name of Levison Wood. You should check out that podcast, the Levison Wood podcast. Okay. He walked the Nile. He's walked the Nile. Cool. He's circumvented the Arabian Peninsula. But you should maybe, I could connect you with him, and that would be he's done a lot. He's walked a ton of different places, but his book was really interesting as well, Walking the Nile. But I'm just saying, I don't know. You seem like a woman who's just going to stare the fear in the face and say, bring it at me. I don't care about your red zone, your narcos. I don't care about your river pirates, and forget about the bull sharks. You didn't even hardly mention I don't even think you even mentioned bull sharks in the book. So anyway.
Oh, we didn't see any. So
yeah, well, but
well, it would be good to kayak the Nile, I guess, because there's everyone agrees that the Amazon is the world's largest river by volume.
Yeah.
But everyone goes back and forth over the Nile or the Amazon, which is the longest. So if I did it, I could have.
You'd be the undisputed champ. Undisputed champ, right? Like then there's like, especially at your age, right? You're doing things that 25-year-olds can't do. I'm just saying.
I do think older people are better at endurance stuff, so I've got that going for me.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, listen, Darcy, for the listeners, name of the book, and how can the listeners find it?
Oh, well, I have a copy here.
Well, show the copy if you would.
Yeah. Amazon Woman. I realized after I named it that it's not a good title, because when you stick that into Amazon.com, you don't find my book very easily. So put in Amazon Woman plus Darcy.
That's so funny.
That'll be good. Yeah, people can also check out my website, which is amazonwoman.net.
Listen, I appreciate you coming on. Fun conversation today. Presentation was a little better than you advertised it to be. I'm just going to say.
Oh, good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Had a good time.
Quite Franklin is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor legal advice, nor a statement of Quite Franklin policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation of that product or entity by Rich Franklin or Quite Franklin. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Quite Franklin employees or representatives are the views and opinions of the persons expressing them, and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Quite Franklin or any of its officials or principals. Nothing heard on this podcast at any time is medical advice or is intended as medical advice. The listener must always consult his or her personal physician or other qualified medical professional regarding any questions of a medical nature. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact our general counsel.